Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware is made up of the initials of our full name, Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, August 15th in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois, back after a summer vacation. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world and the racism against people in foreign countries, encouraged sotto voce by our government as an excuse, not the reason, for those wars. At this moment, the U.S. is making war and killing people in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. Thousands of U.S. troops are fighting in these wars, although most Americans are not aware of it. In addition, the 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they are nothing less than American death squads. Why is our government terrorizing the world to the point that international polls show the U.S. is by far the most feared country in the world? Not Russia, China, or North Korea, or Iran. The answer is simple and horrible. The U.S. is killing people to protect the profits of the 1%, the American economic elite. Aware was formed 16 years ago, after the attacks on New York and Washington on 9/11/2001, and before the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan on 7 October 2001, which began America's longest war, still going on. Barack Obama was the first U.S. president in history to have been at war all the way through 2 presidential terms. The founders of Aware saw that the U.S. government would use the crimes of 9/11 as an excuse to carry on its wars in the Mideast. The U.S. government says it's fighting terrorism, but is in fact killing people in order to control Mideast oil, what the U.S. State Department called in 1945 the world's greatest material prize. The U.S. doesn't need Mideast oil. What we use here comes principally from the U.S., Canada, Venezuela, and Nigeria. But control of oil from Southwest Asia and North Africa gives the U.S. a chokehold over economic rivals who need that oil, from Germany to China. Since World War II, U.S. presidents have killed between 20 and 30 million people for the profits of the American economic elite. Ordinary Americans have paid for these vicious wars, but they haven't profited from them. Most Americans are not aware of how much of the world is appalled at what the U.S. government has done in our lifetimes. It's a triumph of the American system of propaganda, intellectual control, the most effective in history, that Americans are able to ignore it. Those of us in Aware, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, today call upon President Trump to, 1, establish a foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations. 2, end the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere, and stop the drone attacks. 3, cut military spending by at least 50%, and close the more than 700 foreign military bases. Russia has 15. China has 1. Bring U.S. troops and weapons home, and withdraw U.S. special forces who've been sent into 3/4 of the world's countries. 4, stop U.S. support of human rights abusers, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia. And 5, lead on global nuclear disarmament. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you don't get a very clear account of it in the American media, which are dominated by the pro-war U.S. political establishment. We'll try to give a better account tonight, beginning with some notes on the horrors in Charlottesville, Virginia. We're all shocked by the killing of an anti-racist demonstrator in Charlottesville and the injuries to others, and condemn the obscene assertions of white supremacy. But we should recall that the greatest crimes in the world today, U.S. war-making around the world, is not the result of white supremacy. It's the result of capitalism. The U.S. government is making war around the world and sending troops into more than 80 countries, not for the white race, but for the U.S. economic elite, the 1%. Jeffrey Sinclair, the editor of Counterpunch, writes that the Virginia Governor McAuliffe said that police didn't engage the demonstrators in Charlottesville because the armed racists had better weapons than they did. That's amazing. St. Clair comments that the police seem so scared of unarmed black men, they shoot first and ask questions later. But they're not scared of, we'll try that again. St. Clair writes, police are so scared of unarmed black men, they shoot first and ask questions later. They're so scared of armed white men, they do nothing and just let them go home when they feel like it. It's hard not to see the disorders in Charlottesville as a result of ineffective policing and of a gun culture that allows demonstrators to be as armed as these Charlottesville demonstrators apparently were, enough to frighten the local police department. There has now emerged a video of the driver who ran his car into a group of demonstrators, injuring many of them and killing one. And it raises a question whether that ramming was actually a terrorist event, so to speak, as it's being pictured by the media, or it may indeed have been accidental, even though the driver of the car seems to have been a sympathizer, to put no finer point on it, of the racists who were conducting the demonstration. The nature of the event, and particularly the motive of the driver, are still far from conclusive, and in the best situation, if it can be put that way, this will become clear in his trial. New video footage has emerged which may point to the fact that the driver of the Dodge that ran into the people, killing one, may have been a case of fright and flight rather than a premeditated act of violence. The footage that's posted on YouTube, you can see it there, on the channel Squawker Media, throws doubt on the mainstream narrative, which is generally assumed that the action was committed by the driver with a malicious intent to cause harm. The clip shows the vehicle in question driving down the road at a slow speed, while those beside it do not show any fear or otherwise noteworthy reaction. Later, an individual is seen heaving a large object at the vehicle, and it was only then that the car speeds up. Now, what the actual circumstances are of the guilt of the driver will have to be determined by the courts. The horrible outcome is that one woman is dead and many people are injured by this event. It is unfortunately leading to political asseverations that at least regard some require us to do some more thinking about what's being said and done here. The website Moon of Alabama, which I recommend in general, writes, U.S. liberals cuddle fascists and right-wing religious extremists in Libya, Syria, Ukraine, Venezuela, and elsewhere. But when similar movements appear on their own streets, they're outraged. U.S. politicians and media hail such persons when they appear, often hired by the CIA, to overthrow the government of some foreign country. They condemn the same mindset and actions at home. But glorification of right-wing violence elsewhere hands justification to right-wing groups at home. The website has pictures of a fascist torch march in Kiev, Ukraine, in January of 2017. At that time, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, Republican Senator McCain, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many liberals supported the Nazis in Kiev. These pictures are paralleled with Pictures of a fascist torch march in Charlottesville on August 11, 2017. Former presidential candidate Hillary Clinton, Republican Senator McCain, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many liberals condemned those Nazis. There is a problem here. You cannot have one of these without the other. To claim, as liberals do now, that such marches as in Charlottesville, quote, is not what and who we are, close quote, is a lie. Ask people from outside the U.S. how the empire appears and acts towards them. The U.S. uses fascism, religious extremism, torture, targeted killing, and many other vile instruments of power in its quest for global dominance. All of these methods and ideologies, all of them, will one day come home. The leftist, for lack of a better term, magazine Jacobin, which has been publishing some very good things, has a piece running now entitled No More Charlottesvilles. And they say the most important task in the U.S. today is stopping the racists who demonstrated in Charlottesville. It's a peculiar article because are they really asking for us to stop them from demonstrating on the grounds of the ideas that they are putting forward, or are they insisting that it necessarily results in tragedy as the one in Charlottesville did, and therefore they should not be allowed to speak? Noam Chomsky said years ago in similar circumstances, if we don't believe in freedom of expression for people we despise, we don't believe in it at all. That seems to me right. And the most important task in the U.S. today, Pace Jacobin, is not stopping these demonstrations, it's stopping the U.S. government from making war and killing people around the world. The best use of resources is stopping the neoconservative, that is more war, and neoliberal, that is more inequality, policies that the Obama-Clinton administration practiced, and that the political establishment is making sure, with the threat of a coup, that the Trump administration will follow. AWARE as an organization, and many others like it across the country, demand that we bring all U.S. troops and weapons home, that we establish Medicare for all, a universal basic income, things that actually support the American populace, support the popular rejection, which is coming from the American populace, of 40 years of its immiseration. And this is important because the only government that the only enemy that the U.S. government really fears is finally the American populace. There's an article that I will place on the AWARE Facebook page. I'll put a link to on the AWARE Facebook page from Edward Luttwak. Luttwak is a defense intellectual, but a bit of a maverick in some ways, and has an article that appears, of all places, the Times Literary Supplement this week, connecting 40 years of immiseration of the American populace and the election of Donald Trump. I think he's right about this. I think that is indeed what happened. Trump won a few states also because they suffered the most military deaths, and that voting anti-war is the only legitimate strategy for voters and candidates alike. The anti-war vote was not remarked on at all in the last election by any side for obvious reasons. Both candidates, that's not quite right. The leading candidates are all in support of the Obama-Clinton administration's war-making around the world, even though, in fact, it was criticized by candidate Trump. It was not an issue, as it were, in the campaign, but apparently it was an issue in the voting, and that a lot of the people who otherwise would have voted for the Democratic candidate, particularly in a number of Midwest communities that were impacted by the casualties from the war that is not being much mentioned in the media, they did not vote, as expected, for the government, for the administration, for the Obama-Clinton administration in the person of Mrs. Clinton, and therefore Trump became president. The quiet from the American government on the issues that obtrude now in Charlottesville is remarked upon elsewhere. Julian Assange of WikiLeaks asked why the U.S. said nothing when Obama supported Ukrainian neo-Nazis, because after all, that was what happened. The Obama administration supported neo-Nazis in Kiev, in the Ukraine, in order to detach Ukraine from association with Russia. Assange asked why the U.S. said nothing when Obama supported neo-Nazis in Kiev, and then views with alarm the appearance of neo-Nazis in the U.S. Once again, double my standards, double my fun, as the late Alex Coburn used to say. The media accounts of these issues do look peculiar. Our researcher, Dr. No, asks, is democracy now, supposedly liberal television program for many years, is democracy now pursuing the Democratic Party's funders' message? Quote, those who want the deep state to prosper seem to want Trump out of office because a hypothetical President Pence would be more likely to meet their objectives. That is, start new wars more easily, hand over more economic control to the big banks, and whatever else. Every day they offer up complaints about the smallest issues while ignoring issues of substance, because that would mean complaining about the deep state as well. This deep state notion is difficult, but roughly it means the permanent government, the established bureaucratic collection of interests running from the Pentagon through the, quote, intelligence community and into the major political parties. So we get complaints about not saying, not denouncing with the right jargon, complaints about what President Trump said about Charlottesville, while racist policies, doing too little on fixing national lead problems, national potable water problems, continue to help Israel kill Palestinians and carve up Palestinian land, not honoring Native American treaties, they continue unabated. It's not that there aren't good critiques of Trump to be had, it's that the mainstream media have consistently picked bad arguments, including arguments they would not tolerate if a woman were POTUS, like comments on body shape and size and hairdo. How many times have you heard Trump referred to as a joke about something orange? Jeffrey Sinclair of Counterpunch continues with his description of the present situation by noting that the Democrats are now demanding that Trump fire Steve Bannon, his chief strategist, to prove he, Trump, is serious about confronting racists. The constant charge against Bannon is that he is a racist. By the same measure, though, says Sinclair, shouldn't the Democrats expel all of their members who voted for the racist Clinton crime bill, which has arguably inflicted more damage on black America than any legislation since the Fugitive Slave Act? This would, of course, include Bernie Sanders, who remains unrepentant about his vote for the Clinton crime bill. These are the things that need to be brought to the attention, not just of our leaders, who know about them and refuse to notice them, but the public at large. Bertolt Brecht, the playwright and poet who died on August 14, 1956, said famously, "Though the rich of this earth find no difficulty in creating misery, they can't bear to see it." I want to turn now to a comment by David Swanson. David Swanson, who has written on anti-war topics for a good while now, and is very much worth reading, lives in Charlottesville, Virginia, and he wrote a piece this week entitled Top 10 Misconceptions about Charlottesville. He notes that Charlottesville is a small town with the University of Virginia, a pedestrian downtown street, and very few monuments. The three located right downtown are for Robert Edward Lee, the General of the Confederacy, Stonewall Jackson, a leading Confederate general, and the Confederacy, the association of states that seceded in 1860. I was shocked the other night to see on television a street discussion where people were stopped at random and asked who were the opponents in the American Civil War. And none of the people apparently chosen at random, although the tape could be edited, of course, had any idea. Historical ignorance is not unknown among Americans, but it's particularly bad when the historical issues are the symbolic concerns of contemporary serious social issues like race relations. Back to Charlottesville, neither Robert Lee, nor Stonewall Jackson had anything to do with Charlottesville during the war, and their statues were put up in whites-only parks in the 1920s. This is important. We sometimes think that American racism peaked at the time of the Civil War and has been declining ever since. That's not quite true. It's not true at all. And it's true that most of the Confederate monuments that we see around the country were put up in the poisoned race relations of the early 20th century, not the generation or two after the Civil War. That was true of the Confederate monuments to Confederate generals in Charlottesville. The racists who've begun coming to Charlottesville this month to campaign for governor, garner attention, threaten violence, engage in violence, and commit murder, the car crash, are almost all from outside Charlottesville and extremely unwelcome here, writes David Swanson. Charlottesville is a slightly left-of-center Democratic Party area. Most people don't rally for good causes or against bad ones. Most people don't want the Lee statue taken down, or at least they didn't until it became a gathering point for neo-Confederates. That's people who claim to have some continuity with the Southern secessionists. It's mostly made up to support contemporary racist politics. Most people want other memorials added to public space to diversify, and most people don't want white supremacists coming to town with their hatred and their violence. David Swanson continues, armed attacks are not covered by the First Amendment. I can and have argued at length for a strategic, never mind legal, need to respect odious free speech, and more importantly, to respect and build bridges of understanding to the troubled people preaching hatred. But the human right to free speech is not found in a gun or a torch or a can of pepper spray any more than in corporate advertising. When we hold peace rallies in U.S. cities, we're sometimes forbidden to bring posters on wooden poles. We have to use hollow cardboard tubes to hold our signs because, advocates of nonviolence can be so violent. Yet racist, nationalist, white supremacist agitators were allowed to bring an arsenal with which to attack the general public and counter-demonstrators. Whatever that is, it's not free speech. I'd be willing to say it's closer to enabling terrorism. All media habits of balance and even-handedness become lies when respect for rights and blame for deaths and injuries are based on the notion that premeditated violence and threats of violence and the carrying of weapons are not worth noticing. And that seems to be what the Charlottesville police did. Charlottesville mayor voted against taking down the Lee statue, even if he now sounds on NBC News as if it had been his idea. Seen from a certain angle, that's progress. I want people to get on board with the idea of taking down all racist monuments and all war monuments. And this one is both. But it's a misconception to imagine the decision to take down General Lee came from the top or that it came without extensive public input. It's true that City Council member Zakos publicly proposed the dominance of our public space by Confederate statues as a problem, and that City Council member Bellamy pushed for that. But it was the national movement of Black Lives Matter and local activism that created the demand in the first place, as well as making Bellamy a member of the City Council. The city had very lengthy and public and extensive hearings and gatherings of facts and views. A report was issued, and when the City Council voted to take down Lee's statue, but leave up Jackson's statue, it did so because City Council member Bob Fenwick joined two others in a 3-2 vote, in which the mayor, Mike Singer, was on the losing and cowardly side. Now, this is the situation that produced the occasion for the demonstration in Charlottesville. But the military and the militarized police were not here to protect you. An armed force on the streets and in the air of Charlottesville crashed a helicopter, tragically killing 2 people. But what else did it accomplish? It heightened tensions. It reduced turnout by those opposed to violence and racism. Its aggression towards anti-racists followed the KKK rally in July, contributed to fear of what it would do this time. The Charlottesville police do not need the mine-resistant vehicle they keep in their garage. There are no landmines. We do not need our skies filled, including on the Friday before the rally, with military helicopters. We do not need tanks on our streets. We need to disarm those seeking to exercise their First Amendment rights, not arm someone else. The helicopter should never have crashed because it never should have flown. And every individual who assaulted and threatened people with pepper spray, torches, sticks, fists, or an automobile should have been welcomed to nonviolently, without guns or other weaponry, speak their mind, and to speak with those opposing their views. David Swanson, who's writing this article about his hometown of Charlottesville and the events that occurred there, goes on to suggest that to support the impeachment of Donald Trump because of what was seen as his inadequate first responses to the events in Charlottesville. I think, in fact, Swanson's wrong about this. This is a larger issue in the U.S. right now. The War Party wants Trump out because it fears he'll act on his anti-neocon statements from the campaign. That is, he'll reduce the war-making that the U.S. is doing around the world. Trump has ended CIA support for terrorists in Syria, which Obama had established. Trump is said to be considering withdrawing U.S. troops from Afghanistan. Obama, who was elected as a peace candidate, remember, sent thousands more U.S. troops into Afghanistan, and the media inform us that the Trump administration is considering doing something similar now, but there also are reports that this is a matter of dispute within the Trump administration, and that Trump's criticism of the Afghanistan war voiced during the campaign may, in fact, be on the point of being enacted in some peculiar way. There is another matter here that's worth talking about finally in relationship to Charlottesville, and that is the self-congratulatory and propagandistic account of the Civil War that we're getting from the American media. It's an issue that we might go into sometime a little later, but the idea that what happened in Charlottesville depends upon an understanding of the American Civil War is, I think, quite false. And we should perhaps deal with that at some point. There's another matter that has come up even before Charlottesville in regard to demonstrations like that in Charlottesville, and that's what we're getting from folks who refer to themselves as part of Antifa, anti-fascism. And we're getting suggestions here that the demonstrators, the racist demonstrators in places like Charlottesville need to be confronted directly and indeed attacked on the streets by fists and shoving in order to show them that this sort of talk can't go on. Now, not only is this obvious interference with people who have free speech rights, even if what they're saying is horrendous, it also is a desperately ineffective and dangerous tactic. Noam Chomsky recently responded to what he calls a flood of letters from mostly young readers confused by his rejection of violence in responding to a resurgent far right. And Chomsky responds to that as follows. He says, it's wrong in principle and tactically self-destructive. When we move to the arena of violence, the most brutal guys win. That's the worst outcome, and incidentally, that's not us. The right response is to use the opportunity for education and exposure, not to give a gift to the hard right while attacking fundamental principles of freedom of speech. We've been through all of this before, for example, with the Weathermen. The Weather People were a branch of Students for a Democratic Society in the early 1970s, who, as part of the anti-war movement, decided that there needed to be street violence and bombings in order to attack the American establishment that was carrying on a vicious and illegal war in Vietnam. The Vietnamese themselves, who were resisting American aggression, pleaded with the Weather People, the American students, to stop actions like these, understanding very well that each such act simply increased support for the war. In this case, the motive is far less significant, but the consequences are very likely to be the same, and we can see that they already are. That's quite apart from the question of principle. There could be a constructive response that would not simply be a welcome gift to the far right and those elements in the state yearning for a pretext for repression to use the opportunity for education and organizing. In the midst of this, it's interesting to remember an anniversary this week that came across my virtual desk. That was the anniversary of the execution of Sophie Scholl in 1943 for leading student resistance against Hitler. She was 21 years old. Scholl's last words were, "How can we expect righteousness to prevail when there is hardly anyone willing to give himself up individually to a righteous cause? Such a fine sunny day, and I have to go. But what does my death matter if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" Close quote. That seems right, and the action is probably not street violence against racists. You're watching Aware on the Air, and we are a little short of time. I am going to post on the Aware Facebook page a comment on the war escalation plans that the Trump administration is supposedly considering. But in fact, I think I'll take a moment and finish up tonight with a comment on those plans by Ron Paul. By the end of this month, Defense Secretary James Mattis and National Security Advisor McMaster will deliver to President Trump their plans for military escalations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. President Trump would be wise to rip the plans up and send his national security team back to the drawing board or to replace them. There's no way another surge in Afghanistan and Iraq, plus a new one in Syria, puts America first. There's no way doing the same thing over again will succeed any better than it did last time. Near the 10th anniversary of the U.S. war in Afghanistan 7 years ago, I went to the floor of Congress, Ron Paul writes, to point out that the war makes no sense. The original authorization had little to do with eliminating the Taliban. It was a resolution to retaliate against those who attacked the United States on September 11, 2001. From what we know now, the government of Saudi Arabia had far more to do with the financing and planning of 9/11 than did the Taliban. But we're still pumping money into that lost cause. We're still killing Afghanis, and in so doing, creating the next generation of terrorists. The war against ISIS will not end with its defeat in Mosul and Raqqa. We will not pack up and go home. Instead, the Pentagon and the State Department have both said that U.S. troops would remain in Iraq after ISIS is defeated. The continued presence of U.S. troops in Iraq will provide all the recruiting needed for more ISIS or ISIS-like resistance groups to arise, which will in turn lead to permanent U.S. occupation of Iraq. The U.S. experts have completely misdiagnosed the problem, so it is no surprise the solutions will not work. They've claimed that al-Qaeda and ISIS rose in Iraq because we left, when actually they arose because we invaded in the first place, and we now come to learn that we supported their development. President Trump's generals all seem to be pushing for a major U.S. military escalation in the Middle East and South Asia. The president goes back and forth, one minute saying we're not going into Syria, while the next seeming to favor another surge. He's given the military much decision-making latitude and may be persuaded by his generals that the only solution is to go in big. If he follows such advice, it is likely his presidency itself will be buried in the graveyard of empires. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group in the 33rd week of 2017. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is not made up of just the attacks by ISIS and its sympathizers around the world, but by U.S. worldwide war-making. Our thanks tonight to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson for research. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Dan Penno. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube, and see the Facebook page for Aware for articles referred to tonight. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't: Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Esterbrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.
It's The Real News. I'm Aaron Mate. The opioid drug crisis is the deadliest in U.S. history. And on Thursday, President Trump indicated he will formally declare it a national emergency.
The opioid crisis is an emergency, and I'm saying officially right now it is an emergency. It's a national emergency. We're going to spend a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of money on the opioid crisis.
Joining me now is Dr. Gabor Mate, a physician and author of several books, including In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction. And full disclosure, he is also my father. Hello there.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us. So let's start first with what this crisis is. The figures on overdose deaths in the U.S. are something like 140 every single day, 2/3 from opioids. So describe for us what kind of crisis we're dealing with here.
Well, as the President's Commission said, every 3 weeks in the U.S. you have the equivalent of a 9/11. So that every year at current rates, you have 14, 15, 9/11s happening. So in that sense, it's reasonable to speak about it as an emergency. In other sense, of course, it's been going on for a long, long, long time. It's just that the numbers have got increased in the recent years.
The numbers, and also in terms of who the victims are, right, demographically?
Yes, it's now being found that the life expectancy of the white working and middle class is decreasing because of alcoholism and drug overdoses. So it's a question of who it's hitting. It has always struck certain sectors of the population, but now it's hitting the mainstream.
The implication there is that that's the reason why it's perhaps getting so much more attention and resources now.
Well, there was an article in New York Times earlier this year which said exactly that because it's now hitting the white middle class, people are really starting to wonder what it's all about and what else can we do beside the usual ineffective responses. And it's interesting enough that in the 2016 election, Trump got some of the biggest support in areas that are hardest hit by alcoholism and the opioid crisis and suicides.
And why do you think that is?
Because that speaks to the very heart of addiction and what drug use is all about. It's all about an attempt to escape from desperation, And those areas are the areas of the country where there's the greatest desperation. And those are the ones that most were susceptible to Trump's message.
Okay, so let's talk about that. You talk about addiction being an attempt to escape desperation. You've worked with addicts over many years. You were a physician at the Portland Hotel Society, which is a residential and hospice service for residents of Vancouver's downtown east side, an area with a huge drug problem. Talk more about that, addiction being rooted in an attempt to escape adverse conditions.
Well, if you look at the opiates, what are they? The opiates have been used in medicine for thousands of years. Used for what? Used for pain relief. They're the most powerful pain relievers that we have. But they don't only soothe physical pain, they also soothe emotional pain, because it turns out that the same area of the brain that experiences suffering from physical pain also experiences suffering from emotional pain. In other words, the primary question in any addiction, but especially in opiate addiction, is not why the addiction, but why the pain. So we have to look at what is the pain that people are trying to escape from. And for that, there are two major causes. One cause is childhood trauma. And we could talk about how childhood trauma actually affects the brain in such a way as to make it more susceptible to addictions later on. So childhood trauma is one source of deep pain. And all the addicts I worked with had been traumatized, significantly so. And that's what the large-scale studies in the US show as well, that the more trauma in childhood, exponentially the greater the risk of addiction. So childhood trauma is a huge problem in our society and in American society. The other question is what's going on right now, and that's stress, because what we also know is that stress makes the brain more susceptible to addiction, and stress also makes people more desirous of escape from the stress. And so if you look at what's happening socially, economically, politically, culturally, there's increasing insecurity, increasing stress, increasing uncertainty, increasing difficulty for people. And therefore, people will turn to short-term measures to escape those difficulties, or at least the awareness of them, by escaping into addictions, including drug use. So what we're looking at is A, childhood trauma, and B, severe social stress. And it's not surprising that the areas where Trump got the greatest support are areas of great social stress.
Right. So taking your analysis and looking at this response now, Trump poised to, it appears, declare this a national emergency. Looking at how this problem is discussed, what do you think is missing from the conversation and from the actual policy choices that are being made to respond to it?
Well, the conversation in the mainstream media and in political circles, and I would say even in medical circles, largely excludes the central importance of trauma and stress. So they talk about the problem of addiction as if it was simply a matter of a choice that somebody makes, in which case, two things you can do. One is you can try to deter people, or at least dissuade them from making that choice. And that's what your Attorney General, the American Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, talked about reviving the old Nancy Reagan just say no ethic, where you're just telling people how bad drugs are and then they won't use them. And
you know what? I'm going to cut in and actually, it wasn't just Sessions, it was also Trump. This is him speaking just a few days ago. Let's hear what he says, and you can respond to this as well.
The best way to prevent drug addiction and overdose is to prevent people from abusing drugs in the first place. If they don't start, they won't have a problem. If they do start, it's awfully tough to get off. So we can keep them from going on, and maybe by talking to youth and telling them no good, really bad for you in every way. But if they don't start, it will never be a problem.
If they don't start, it will never be a problem.
Yes, and that again is based on the view that just telling people how bad drugs are will keep them from using them. Well, if that strategy worked, why do we have the crisis right now? If the Nancy Reagan just say no and telling people how bad it is to use drugs strategy worked, why has the heroin use rate in the U.S. gone up fivefold in the last 10 years, and why the current crisis? So clearly that doesn't work. The reason it doesn't work is that drug addiction is not a choice that anybody makes. Nobody chooses to do that. And the real question is, how do we get that information across? Well, the problem is that the children, the young people who are listening to adults are not the ones at risk. And the ones who are at risk are not listening to adults. So it doesn't matter what we tell the kids, because again, the ones who don't need it, they'll get it. And the ones who need the information won't get it because they're the hurt ones and the abused ones and the alienated ones to whom this kind of message falls on deaf ears. Now, yes?
No, go ahead.
Well, the second perspective is that addiction is this disease that people inherit. And again, that excludes looking at people's lives, looking at their childhood trauma history, at their family history of multi-generational trauma perhaps, and looking at all the social factors that put stress on people. So that while the addicted brain looks like a diseased brain, that's true enough, what the disease perspective leaves out is that that disease is a result of life experiences and social factors. And so simply talking about trying to stop or prevent the addiction without looking at those social factors and those personal historical factors. And then when you treat people without treating their trauma and treating their pain, you can't really authorize people.
What about the side, though, that says the main problem is the supply, especially from, in the case of opioids, from big pharmaceutical companies? You know, Purdue Pharma, it's well known that they entered OxyContin into the market in the mid-90s. That led to a huge, they concealed some of the impacts of it, and that did lead to a huge spike in addictions and overdoses.
It's certainly true that the pharmaceutical companies profit, and very happily, over the overuse of pharmaceuticals. That's true. And it's also true that Purdue, which engaged in subterfuge that contributed to the deaths of hundreds of people, paid a very small price, and none of their executives went to jail, contrary to a small-time drug dealer who was responsible for much less depredation. So that's true. However, as an American judge very astutely said, that you can no more control or suppress the law of supply and demand than you can suppress or control the law of gravity. So the real issue is not just the availability, because people will use something. People that need to escape will use something. If they will not use available prescription drugs, they will use illicit heroin. And there's a lot of cheap heroin available in the United States right now. If they will not use that, they use crystal meth, they'll use cocaine, they'll use alcohol, they'll use something. So ultimately, while it's certainly true that the pharmaceutical companies have contributed to this, and it's also true that physicians have contributed to it because of their insufficient understanding of chronic pain and how to deal with it, ultimately we still have to look at the broad social factors. And in individual cases, we have to address those factors when we're treating people.
Right. You know, on the issue of treatment, I went to an event recently where I heard people who have experienced dealing with rehab facilities, having loved ones who are in rehab facilities. And it was just a series of complaints about these facilities did not properly address their loved ones' issues. Specifically, there was no sort of, or very little therapy and attempts to address people's internal pain. I'm wondering your thoughts on that, the issues that the rehab approach and then treatment in general might face.
Well, the problem is that most addiction specialists, physicians, psychiatrists, and counselors do not get trained in trauma. In fact, it's quite possible for most trainee physicians in the United States, in my country, Canada, to graduate without ever hearing the word trauma, let alone learning how to deal with it. So it's not surprising that when people go to rehab facilities, the attention and the emphasis is put on strictly on the behavior of addiction and trying to get them to stop the behavior, and not on the causes that made them addicted in the first place. So people go to rehab and then they're never helped to integrate and deal with their emotional pain, with their trauma. They're never given the help to help them rewire their brains in such a way that they can go out there and deal with stress more effectively and more um, uh, consciously, with more awareness.
Right. So as we wrap, I have two questions about the psychological dynamics of addiction. And the first is one that you touched on a bit earlier. What is the neuroscience of addiction? Why is someone with trauma, with unaddressed childhood pain, more wired to become addicted?
Well, first of all, because of the pain itself. All addictions, in my view, are an attempt to escape from emotional pain, discomfort, distress. And the more distress, discomfort, pain, shame you have, the more likely you will want to escape from it through addictions. And that's an impact of trauma. Secondly, the childhood experience itself wires the brain. So how the human brain develops, this is not controversial, this is just state-of-the-art brain science. How the human brain develops depends very much on the early environment and particularly the emotional atmosphere. So how connected and attuned and emotionally present, or on the contrary, how stressed, absent, perhaps traumatized themselves the parents are, will actually affect the wiring of the brain. So for the healthy brain development, you need a calm, connected, attuned, non-stressed parenting environment, which is less and less available to American kids owed to social circumstances. And then thirdly, if you look at the brain circuits involved in addiction, the opiate circuits where the opiate medications work, or the incentive motivation circuits where all the drugs and all the behaviors, addiction from gambling to sex to internet work. If you look at the circuits of emotional stress regulation and self-regulation, if you look at the circuits of impulse regulation, where we can make decisions not to engage in something even though we want to, if we know that it's bad for us, all these circuits develop or don't develop in response to the early environment. In other words, the greater the early stress and the trauma and the less calm and supportive the early environment, the greater the risk that person is at for addiction later on. And not to mention for addiction, not only for addiction, also for mental health problems. So as this interim report by the President's Commission pointed out, about 40% of substance users also have correlated mental health issues, which also need to be addressed. And by the way, I would say 40% is a gross underestimate, and it's probably closer to 80, 90%.
And quite likely they're using drugs to deal or cope with those mental health issues.
Very often drugs are, apart from the general escape they provide from stress and emotional pain and distress, they're also specifically self-medications for diagnosable mental health conditions, such as post-traumatic stress, such as depression, such as anxiety, such as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, such as bipolar illness, such as social phobia, and so on. And so, again, these conditions and their basis in trauma all have to be addressed if we were to help addicts, addicted people, really overcome their problem.
Okay, so a final question, and it's also about psychology, and I'm curious your thoughts on what is the psychology of those who stigmatize addicts, who have a hard time seeing them as people in need, people with pain, more seeing them from a criminal perspective. What in your view is going on there?
That's a great question. I think there are three levels that we can distinguish here. One is on the level of thought. They just don't understand. They haven't actually looked at what drives addiction. They see it as a moral question because this is how they've been taught, and they have no other perspective. So on the level of thought, it's just shallow thinking based on lack of information. On the level of emotion, though, there's a tremendous hostility towards drug users and addicts on the part of a lot of people. Now, what is that all about? I believe what that's all about is something that Jesus talked about when he said, "Don't judge lest ye be judged." He said basically it points out that all the judgments we make of others are always, in the end, come back to ourselves. And so if we look at American society or Western society in general, it's a highly addicted culture. People have all kinds of addictions. And there's not really a deep difference between drug addictions and sex addictions and gambling addiction and shopping addiction and eating addictions and in terms of their causes, in terms of their brain circuits, and in terms of negative impact. What I'm saying is,
Well, but listen, a lot of people would push back on that and say you can't compare the impact of heroin use to the impact of gambling or sex or whatever else.
well, first of all, we can make a more direct comparison if we look at cigarette use or alcohol use. You can make a direct comparison between cigarette use and alcohol use, and on the one hand, and heroin use on the other. And you know what the comparison says? The comparison says that heroin use is far safer. In other words, if you take 1,000 people who smoke or drink heavily or who inject heroin, as long as they don't overdose, 30 years from now, there'll be a lot more disease, a lot more death in the alcohol and cigarette groups than in the heroin group.
But this is assuming though that the heroin is clean, right? Because obviously street heroin is far different.
That's what I'm saying. We have this arbitrary decision as to what drugs are acceptable and what drugs are not.
Right.
But what I am saying is that people don't have the same opprobrium, the same negative, hostile response to smokers and people who drink. In fact, drinking is publicly advertised on the Super Bowl. So it's totally arbitrary. In other words, it's purely an emotional reaction. And what I'm saying is that the emotional reaction is based on the fact that addictions are so rife in our society, we just don't want to admit it. So we want to see the addict as somehow different. We want to see them as inferior to us. Then we want to judge them, and then we can feel superior. So that's on the emotional level. On the neurological level, this part of the brain here, in the front part of the brain, the midfrontal cortex, has a function which is called response flexibility, which means that when we are confronted with the situation, we can consider the facts, we can calmly evaluate what's best, and respond from a flexible rather than an emotionally reactive point of view. Now, for a lot of people in our society, that response flexibility is not available. And they tend to react from an emotional based, patterned, reactive ground. And so they don't have the equipment themselves. They're not mindful enough to really consider what's actually going on. So instead of being responsive, they're being reactive. And that reaction is an emotional one of hostility.
Okay, and very quickly as we wrap, because we haven't talked about it yet, but it relates to what we're talking about right now, which is that clean heroin is provided to people at safe injection sites like the one that you worked at in Vancouver's downtown east side. I'm wondering if you could talk about that quickly and the impact that has had on the community.
Well, the first thing we have to realize is that much of the negative impact of addiction, drug addiction, is due to the illegal situation, where people have to use unreliable supplies, polluted by what medication, particularly fentanyl, which is lethal. And nobody's advocating that drugs should become legal in the sense of being freely available in the streets or in street or corner stores like cigarettes or alcohol is. But there are programs in Canada and in Europe which have provided clean heroin to confirmed addicts who cannot be helped by methadone or Suboxone or other medications. And these people actually get a prescription, not that they take home, but they inject in the clinic. And it's been shown over and over again that people who are given access to such programs have much less disease, passed on much less disease to other people, far more economically viable, they have better family lives and far fewer health risks, and incur far smaller health costs to the system. So that what I'm suggesting is that although supplied heroin will not be the answer to most people, or certainly not to everybody, but there needs to be response flexibility in the healthcare system. And right now the approaches are way too narrow, way too reactive, and way too limited. If we actually looked at all the possible ranges of what we already know is available to us and all the programs that we could actually use here, we would do much better than we're doing right now.
And just to clarify, in Vancouver, there's two facilities, right? There's the facility where people are provided with prescription heroin, and one where they're not provided with heroin, but they can go and inject safely. And I believe in both these facilities, the overdose deaths around that area have declined sharply, right?
There are two clinics, yes. One is the supervised injection site where people bring their illegal drugs, but they inject them under supervision with no harassment from the police. And they're given clean needles, sterile water. In other words, they don't pass on or receive disease from other people. And if they overdose, they're actually resuscitated. So a lot of lives have been saved. At another clinic, um, just one clinic in Vancouver, they prescribe and supervise prescribed heroin to people under the principles I just explained. Now, unfortunately, Vancouver has also seen a great increase in the overdose deaths, and the clinics have not been able to keep up with that because of the introduction of fentanyl, and still because of the retrograde drug laws that drive people underground. So we're far from having solved the problem in Vancouver, but those two initiatives have demonstrated in many studies a lot of promise.
Dr. Gabor Mate, physician, author of several books, including In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.